Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our 30th annual Presidential Faculty Lecture. I say this every year, but it has the advantage of being true, and that is that selecting a speaker for this annual event is probably the most difficult decision that I face every year as president of the college. And that's because there are so many outstanding faculty members at Dartmouth who are pushing the frontiers of knowledge in just such creative and innovative ways. And that explains why, once again this year, we have a speaker of phenomenal depth and quality. Susan Brison is the Eunice and Julian Cohen Professor for the Study of Ethics and Human Values and Professor of Philosophy here at Dartmouth. She also teaches in the program in Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and has held visiting positions at Tufts, NYU, and Princeton, where in 2016-17, she was the visiting professor for distinguished teaching at the University Center for Human Values. In recognition of her outstanding teaching record, Susan was awarded the Dean of the Faculty Award for Outstanding Mentoring and Advising in 2013 here at Dartmouth. From the day that Susan joined the Dartmouth faculty in 1985, she has engaged tirelessly with the issues of the moment. Her philosophical work is centered in two areas: ethical and legal problems of gender-based violence and freedom of expression. While she speaks brilliantly to both of these topics, the title of tonight's lecture is Sexual Violence, Social Meanings, and the Narrative Selves. And I can say unequivocally that there is no one better qualified to understand and educate us on these topics than Susan. In her 2002 book, Aftermath, Violence, and the Remaking of a Self, Susan uses her own experience of being violently raped as a student as a personal lens through which to explore the effects of sexual violence on identity, discussing the initial disintegration of identity that occurs with severe personal trauma, and its subsequent reconstruction. When presenting Susan with her named professorship back in 2015, former Associate Dean of the Arts and Humanities, Adrian Randolph, said, "Her work, as many have realized, has extraordinary implications for all nature of reconciliations, but also on the ways in which we approach sexual violence in particular. We at Dartmouth, as we struggle with this scourge, the presence of which seems particularly visible on college campuses, would do well to continue heeding Brison's call for attentiveness in the activation of memory, bearing witness, and remaking." Needless to say, Susan's strength, courage, and intellect is simply unmatched, and I couldn't be more proud to count her amongst our most distinguished faculty and to welcome her to share her insights with us tonight. Susan has authored countless articles in anthologies and journals such as Ethics, Nomos, and Legal Theory, co-edited volumes, Contemporary Perspectives on Constitutional Interpretation and Free Speech in the Digital Age, which is forthcoming from Oxford University Press, and written numerous articles that have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Guardian, and the Chronicle Review, amongst others. Susan holds a PhD and MA in philosophy from the University of Toronto and a BA in philosophy from the University of California at Santa Cruz. And now, please join me in welcoming to the stage a brilliant philosopher who has distinguished herself by connecting theory to the lived experience, Professor Susan Brison.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you so much, President Hanlon, for this wonderful, if daunting, invitation and for that extraordinarily generous introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming. I'm honored and humbled and frankly astonished to be standing up here. Sexual violence is always a timely topic, and of course, April is National Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month, as was officially proclaimed a while ago by a president who has boasted about sexually assaulting women. But for all too many of us, it's never not Sexual Assault Awareness Month. The occasion of this talk has a personal significance for me. Exactly 25 years ago, I published my first academic article about rape. Although it was in a peer-reviewed philosophy journal, senior colleagues told me not to keep writing on the subject if I wanted to get tenure. I was warned. I persisted, and here I am. But I wouldn't be giving this talk if it hadn't been for the support and inspiration of many of you in this room. And I wouldn't be here at all without the sustaining love of my spouse, Tom Treesice. So Tom, this is for you. I'm going to begin by quoting some poets who I wish were the unacknowledged legislators of the world, as Shelley claimed. Alas, they're not, in this world anyway. Although I do agree with William Carlos Williams, who wrote, "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." Women too. I think poets have a lot to contribute to philosophy. And it's too bad that since Plato, anyway, our discipline has been reluctant to listen to them. So first, a quote from Bertolt Brecht. "Like one who seeks to warn the city of an impending flood, but speaks another language, so do we come forward and report that evil has been done us." Next, a few lines from Artemis, a poem by Olga Brumas. "I am a woman committed to a politics of transliteration, the methodology of a mind stunned at the suddenly possible shifts of meaning, for which, like amnesiacs in a ward on fire, we must find words or burn." And finally, a sentence from a talk the late poet Lucille Clifton gave at Dartmouth when she was a Montgomery Fellow a few years ago. "Racism is, I can throw a knife at you and then tell you whether it hurts." I'm going to speak about sexual violence as a philosopher and as a survivor of rape. I'm going to ask you to think about why, in spite of over 40 years of feminist anti-rape activism, it's still so rare for rape and other forms of gender-based violence against women to be characterized in politics, the law, the media, popular culture, and everyday discourse as politically important, a politically important phenomenon constituting a grave group-based injustice. Instead, crimes of sexual violence tend to be viewed as either interpersonal and apolitical crimes of passion, or as isolated and utterly random acts of violence. It's particularly puzzling characterizations, given that their clearly gendered nature and the fact that they occur everywhere and with mind-numbing regularity. And rape is defined as sex, albeit without consent. What are the effects of such labeling? What does it keep us from seeing and doing? Now, as unorthodox as it is to begin a philosophy talk with the pronouncements of poets, it's even more unusual to continue a philosophy talk with a first-person narrative, which is what I'm about to do shortly. One of the first philosophy texts I read as an undergraduate was Bertrand Russell's The Problems of Philosophy, in which he wrote, "The free intellect will see as God might see, without a here and now, without hopes and fears, without the trammels of customary beliefs and traditional prejudices, calmly, dispassionately, in the sole and exclusive desire of knowledge. Knowledge is impersonal, as purely contemplative as it is possible for man to attain. Hence also the free intellect will value more the abstract and universal knowledge, into which the accidents of private history do not enter. Then the knowledge brought by the senses, and dependent as such knowledge must be, upon an exclusive and personal point of view, and a body whose sense organs distort as much as they reveal. Now, this is a remarkable how-to guide for getting knowledge. Right? It tells us how to see as God might see, what to desire, knowledge as impersonal, purely contemplative, and even what to value, the abstract and universal knowledge into which the accidents of private history do not enter. It took me nearly 20 years to come around to the very different view espoused by Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil. He writes, "Gradually, it has become clear to me what every great philosophy so far has been, namely, the personal confession of its author and a kind of involuntary and unconscious memoir. Philosophers write about what matters to them, and so it matters who is doing the philosophizing. Although traditionally philosophers have written as if they were disembodied, purely rational beings, who could be situated anywhere at any time and still be thinking the same universal and eternal verities, the fact is we are embodied thinkers, situated in, and I would even say constituted by, the temporal, spatial, social, and other contexts in which we find ourselves. In contrast to Russell and mainstream Anglo-American analytic philosophy, feminist philosophers and critical race theorists have argued that each of us theorizes from a positioned perspective. Many of us from multiple perspectives, and that it's important to acknowledge one's own background and experiences. This focus on the actual lives of real people has not only expanded the subject matter considered appropriate for philosophical analysis, but it's also introduced new methods, such as the use of first-person narratives into philosophy. As Mari Matsuda writes, "I can take on the cloak of the detached universal, but it is an uncomfortable garment. It is not me, and I do not do my best work wearing it." I think it's time for us philosophers to take off our invisibility cloaks. They're not really working anyway. The event I'm about to relate, one that Russell would call an accident of private history, was neither an accident nor a private matter. In July of 1990, a man assaulted me while I was on a morning walk by myself on a country road in the south of France. He jumped me from behind, threw me into the underbrush, beat me, raped me, strangled me into unconsciousness several times, and then dragged me into a ravine, hit me on the head with a rock, and left me for dead. Now, I was an extraordinarily lucky victim. My testimony about the physical facts of what happened during the assault was believed. This is highly unusual in any rape case. However, my experience of what happened as a gender-motivated bias crime committed against me because I am a woman was not. My own lawyer said to me while I was still in my hospital bed, "Don't think of your assailant as a man. Think of him as a wild beast, a lion." I resisted the temptation to say, "I think of him as a Frenchman, like you." And a few months before my assailant's trial, he was tried, found guilty of rape and attempted murder. I met with the Attorney General in Grenoble and went over the dossier to talk about how the case would go. He showed me lots of photographs and testimonies. And after we'd had this discussion, as I was leaving his office, the Attorney General said to me, "After your assailant's trial is over, you must forget that this ever happened." And I said, "Well, that's going to be a little hard for me to do under the circumstances." And he said, "But Madame, you must make an effort." As if this was something that had happened only to me, as if it had never happened to any other woman and would never happen to any other woman. My attempts to bear witness to gender-based violence have been frustrated by the fact that society seems to hold simultaneously two contradictory views about it. First, that there is no such thing as gender-based violence, and second, that sexual violence is to be expected, only natural, something that makes sense. After my hospitalization in France, I returned home to the US and began to tell friends and family members about the assault. Initially, I didn't mention the rape, whether it was because I felt somehow ashamed or because it seemed less salient to me than the attempted murder, I still don't know. Later, when I told others that I had been nearly murdered and they asked why, they were satisfied with the explanation that it had begun as a sexual assault. Now think about that. A young man jumping a woman from behind on a country road, beating and strangling her, leaving her for dead, makes no sense. Add that the woman was sexually assaulted. Suddenly, it makes sense. How the addition of a further criminal act helps to explain the murder attempt remains a mystery to me. Even more so because the further act was physically the same as an act that we refer to as making love. The fact that a man raping and then attempting to murder a woman makes sense to people reveals to me that we as a society do grasp the concept of gender-motivated male violence against women, even as we manage to deny that such a group-based phenomenon really exists. The one reason it's so hard for many to recognize sexual violence against a woman as part of a pattern of gender-based violence is if it's attacked by a stranger, it's viewed as a random act of violence by a psychopath, a monster, a beast, someone who's not one of us. Whereas if it's an attack by a date, acquaintance, partner, spouse, it's considered a crime of passion, motivated by uncontrollable lust or jealous love. That is, if it's considered a crime at all, which in all too many cases it will not be. It's thought to be completely explained by the personal relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. Another reason it's difficult for many to see violence against women as political, as gender-based, is that we live in a culture in which violence against women is sexualized, and sex is bound up with the degradation, humiliation, and brutalization of women. In fact, sexual violence is so common that it doesn't even require a further explanation. It's just part of the way the world is, as invisible as the air we breathe. And it's nothing new. Do any of you know the old folk song from the British Isles, Pretty Polly? I know some of you must. Oh, Adam, of course, you know it. I reckon it's centuries old. It migrated to Appalachia, and it was recorded in the 50s and 60s by Pete Seeger, Sandy Denny, Judy Collins, the Byrds. I heard it and sang it a lot in my youth, and it's currently experiencing a revival in recordings by some of my very favorite musicians, Gillian Welch, David Rawlings, Aoife O'Donovan, Bela Fleck, and Abigail Washburn. And it goes like this. I courted pretty Polly the livelong night. I courted pretty Polly the livelong night, then left her next morning before it was light. Oh, Polly, pretty Polly, come go along with me. Oh, Polly, pretty Polly, come go along with me. Before we get married, some pleasure to see. He brought her over hills and the valleys so deep. He brought her over hills and the valleys so deep, until pretty Polly, she started to weep. Oh, Willie, I'm afraid of your ways. Oh, Willie, I'm afraid of your ways. I'm afraid you will lead my poor body astray. Oh, Polly, pretty Polly, you guessed about right. Oh, Polly, pretty Polly, you guessed about right. I dug on your grave the best part of last night. There's an ellipsis here, but you can infer what takes place. And then, he stabbed her to the heart, her heart's blood did flow. He stabbed her to the heart, and her heart's blood did flow. And into the grave pretty Polly did go. He threw a little dirt o'er her and started for home. He threw a little dirt o'er her and started for home, leaving nothing behind but the wild birds to moan. I courted pretty Polly the livelong night. I courted pretty Polly the livelong night, then left her next morning before it was light. Now, lest you think this song is one of a kind, I should note that Tom Paley, who recorded this with Peggy Seeger, called Pretty Polly, quote, one of the best known of the widely popular murdered girl ballads. It really is a genre. Sometimes it's called the murdered sweetheart genre. Other songs of this genre include Down in the Willow Garden, The Jealous Lover, The Knoxville Girl, and The Banks of the Ohio. I mean, other such songs from my youth include Tom Dooley, met her on the mountain, there I took her life, met her on the mountain, stabbed her with my knife. I used to sing that all the time and not give it another thought. And of course, there's the Beatles song, Run for Your Life. But did you know that the first line, I'd rather see you dead, little girl, than to see you with another man, actually comes from a song called Baby, Let's Play House that was recorded by Buddy Holly and Elvis Presley. It's got this line in it. Now listen to me, baby, try to understand. I'd rather see you dead, little girl, than be with another man. Come back, baby, I want to play house with you. This doesn't sound like a house I would want to go back to. I think these songs illustrate my point about our contradictory views of gender-based violence, that it doesn't exist and that it makes so much sense that we just take it for granted. How do we manage to hold these incompatible views simultaneously? Well, sometimes when something is so prevalent, we no longer see it. Brecht expressed this phenomenon in the poem I quoted from earlier. When evil doing comes like falling rain, nobody calls out, stop. When crimes begin to pile up, they become invisible. When sufferings become unendurable, the cries are no longer heard. The cries, too, fall like rain in summer. As I mentioned, I was a lucky victim. I had a lot of unearned credibility. So my recounting of the facts was believed. But at the same time, my perspective wasn't shared. My narrative wasn't one that could be heard. It was as if I was speaking another language. I faced a double epistemic burden, both as a member of the targeted group, women, and because what happened to me was viewed as just a random, isolated event. We need some new terminology for talking about sexual violence, or at the very least, some new definitions. Alison Jagger has argued that, quote, speaking requires a language, but dominant vocabularies may lack the resources necessary to express perspectives of subordinated groups. Because language is essentially public, creating new vocabularies is necessarily a collective rather than an individual project, end quote. I'm in search of a new language for what we call rape. I'd like to retire the word rape altogether, but failing that, I'd like us to stop defining it as simply sex minus consent or non-consensual sex. I suggest as a provisional alternative that we define rape as sexualized gender-based violence. Now, although men and boys are raped most often by men, and although women are sometimes, though rarely, rapists, the vast majority of rapes are committed by men, and outside of the prison context, the victims are women and girls. So I will, when specifying genders, allude to perpetrators as men and victims as women. This is a misleading oversimplification in a number of ways, including that it may appear to commit me to gender binarism and gender essentialism, both of which I reject. I even consider male-on-male rape to be gender-motivated. The gender at issue here is that of men, informed by traditional ideals of masculinity. But I'm not arguing for that view here. What I'm arguing is that part of our inability to see rape as gender-based violence comes from the language we use to define it. In that article on sexual violence I wrote 25 years ago, I observed that in one of the very few articles written by political philosophers about rape at that time, Ross Harrison wrote, this was in 1986, that, quote, what principally distinguishes rape from normal sexual activity is the consent of the raped woman. Now, there's so many things wrong with this sentence. The consent of the raped woman, but it's hard to know where to begin. But what I noted was there's no parallel to this in the case of other crimes. We don't say what principally distinguishes theft from normal gift giving is the lack of consent of the person stolen from. We don't consider theft to be gift giving minus consent, or murder to be assisted suicide minus consent. Right. In the cases of theft and murder, the notion of violation is built into our concepts of the crimes. So it's inconceivable one could consent to the acts in question. But Harrison was not stating an idiosyncratic view, although he could have stated it more accurately. If rape is correctly defined as sex without consent, then Harrison would have been correct in saying what principally distinguishes rape from normal sexual assault is the lack of consent of the raped woman. But that too sounds odd to my ears. Even odder was Heidi Hurd's claim in a 1996 article that, quote, "The moral magic of consent is that it turns what would otherwise be rape into lovemaking," end of quote. But at least she was consistent. She also claimed that the moral magic of consent turns, quote, "a theft into a gift," end of quote. I mean, this seems to me to presuppose a rather bleak view of human interactions, generally, not only sexual ones. Surely what one feels when giving a dear friend a birthday present isn't this: the only thing that distinguishes this from my friend stealing from me is that I consent to this exchange. I'm going to give some reasons why we should stop defining rape as simply sex minus consent, or non-consensual sex, the language used in many campus misconduct codes. My task here is not to defend a particular definition of rape, although I've suggested one, but rather to critique a currently prevalent definition. I'm clearer about what rape is not than I am about what it is. If I were asked to define rape, my first response would be, who wants to know? And my second would be, what purpose do we want this definition of rape to serve? Why do we need a concept of rape? What do we want the concept of rape to do? Of course, it will and should do different things in different contexts. The concept of rape will have different functions in a courtroom, a therapist's office, a school administrator's meeting, a police station, and a bedroom. To call rape sex without consent in the context of a bedroom conversation, say, between two people sexually attracted to each other, would yield the following nonsensical conversational non-starter. Rape survivor to a potential sexual partner: "You know that thing I did with my assailant without my consent when I was raped? I'd like to do that, or I consent to doing that with you now." Why does this sound so odd? One might think it sounds odd because the raped person didn't do anything. Something was done to her. However, she did do some things. Perhaps she said no, or screamed, or froze, or was silent. She continued to breathe, strategized about how to survive, or possibly dissociated. But whatever she didn't do what we normally think of as having sex. So suppose we say that instead of her having sex, something, sex or whatever it was her assailant was having or doing, was done to her. But this doesn't sound any better in the above bedroom scenario. "You know that thing my assailant did to me without my consent? I want you to do, or I consent to your doing that thing to me now." To be sure, there are advantages to consent talk and conceptualizing the crime of rape. Did he rape her or him on that occasion is the question for fact finders in a criminal rape trial. And so determining whether the alleged victim consented to what was done is of critical importance. Given the current significance of consent in the US criminal justice system, recent philosophical work on sex and consent, and there is a lot of it, is important. We need to figure out what should count as consent and when consent is vitiated by fraud. However, if we want to understand how rape harms its victims, it's direct and indirect, and if we want to eradicate rape, or at least change the culture so that rape is less prevalent, the question, did he do that to her on that occasion? And did she consent to have him do this to her on that occasion? May not be the most important questions, or even appropriate questions, and focusing on them exclusively may be counterproductive. I want to reiterate that this is not to say that the concept of consent is not useful in analyzing the crime of rape, nor to deny the importance of rethinking what constitutes consent. And we've certainly made progress since the days when the rape of a woman was viewed not as a violation of the woman, but rather as the theft or unauthorized use of the property of some man, the raped woman's husband or father. And we've made progress since definitions of the crime of rape were such that victims were required to resist to the utmost and to show signs of physical injuries in addition to those caused by the sexual violence itself. Did you know that until 2013, the definition of rape used by the FBI in their uniform crime reports was, quote, the carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will. Carnal knowledge. And that knowledge had to be obtained forcibly. It had to be hard-won knowledge. Since 2013, the FBI has used the following definition of rape in gathering rape statistics. Quote, penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. This definition is an improvement in many ways. And no, it doesn't call rape non-consensual sex. But it doesn't tell the whole story about rape. Again, I'm not saying consent doesn't matter. In the 2013 Vanderbilt University rape case, in which 4 men allegedly raped an unconscious woman in a dorm room, 3 of the defendants have now been found guilty of aggravated rape. It was essential to the verdict to show that the victim did not consent. And it's progress that we now acknowledge in such cases that one cannot consent while unconscious. But it's important to note that the lack of consent isn't the only thing wrong about this case. One could come up with a hypothetical example similar to the Vanderbilt case, except the victim signed a contract with the 4 men in advance, consenting to being incapacitated by alcohol and to whatever they would do to her later when she became unconscious. Even if we grant, for the sake of argument, that one can give genuine consent on behalf of one's future unconscious self, which I don't believe, I think there would be in this example a serious moral wrong, if not a crime, committed. A former student of mine wrote on Facebook a few years ago of having been gang raped at Dartmouth while others cheered and jeered. She gave me permission to speak about this publicly and even to use her name, which I see no reason to do. She wrote, quote, I remember that moment when they stopped talking to me at all, that fall from subject to object. Try holding her nose so that she'll have to open her mouth. I remember the profound sense of something being something less than human. Because how could they possibly be doing this to another person? My question here is this: how would consent have changed that scenario? Suppose she had signed a consent form saying, I hereby consent to your doing anything you decide to do to me after I'm intoxicated. Would consent have worked its moral magic on whatever these men did to her, making it not criminal, socially acceptable, morally permissible, and to the extent that they got off on it, a good thing? By the way, consent of the victim is not always a defense when charged with a crime. It would be a mistake to think that the only thing that would make someone's raping and killing someone else a crime would be the killer's failure to have obtained the victim's consent to his actions. Here are some arguments for why we shouldn't call rape sex without consent. First, calling rape sex of any sort, including non-consensual, reinforces a connection between sex and violence. In a culture saturated with violently misogynistic representations of women, it's especially problematic to consider consent to be the sole thing that distinguishes sex from rape. Defining rape as sex without consent also individualizes the harm of rape. It focuses our attention exclusively on the mental state of one individual, the victim, and sometimes on whether it was reasonable for the perpetrator to believe that she consented. On the view that rape is sex without consent, it's only one person's autonomy, dignity, or bodily integrity that's violated. This construal keeps us from seeing the political aspect of the wrongness of rape, namely that it's an instance of a larger phenomenon of gender-based violence. This leads us to minimize and mischaracterize the harm to victims. Not to take the group-based nature of the harm of rape into account in its definition is like not taking racism into account in the definition of race-based bias crimes. It's to decontextualize the assault and see it as an isolated incident. Victims of gender-based violence suffer from the epistemic burden of being accorded unfairly diminished credibility. In other words, they tend not to be believed through no fault of their own. Since most victims of gender-based violence are women in societies in which women have, as a group, have less power than men as a group, they suffer the epistemic oppression faced by all marginalized groups. In addition, they bear the burden of having to prove that they're not lying about something that they are considered to be prone to lie about. Until recently, juries in rape trials were given the so-called hail warning that, quote, although rape is a detestable crime, it is also an accusation easily to be made and hard to be proved and harder to be defended by the party accused, though never so innocent, end quote. Now, this is no longer a standard jury instruction, although it was. But as recently as 1997, the Supreme Court of South Dakota wrote in one of their decisions that, quote, allegations of sexual misconduct are easy to allege and difficult to disprove. It's an additional epistemic burden to have the nature and gravity of the harm to which one is trying to bear witness discounted because of the scattered, diffuse nature of the event to which one is testifying. There is a name for this event, gender-based violence, but one can't bear witness to it as such in a court of law or even in the court of public opinion, because each instance of it gets construed as something else, an isolated random attack by a monster or a crime of lust or passion. Even some feminist philosophers miss this point. In her otherwise very illuminating article, A Sensible Anti-Porn Feminism, Ann Eaton writes, quote, sexual assault is an example of a severe injury that is accomplished through a single, isolable act, end quote. It isn't, though, if it's considered to be gender-based violence. The harm of a sexual assault is accomplished through not merely one act, but a long history of such violence, continuing in the present and on into the future in social, political, and cultural contexts that tolerate it. It's a bias crime, both in its effect on the victim and its effect on the community. But we don't typically consider rape, domestic violence, and other forms of what I call gender-based violence to be a bias crime, or to be, like sexual harassment, a form of sex discrimination, a kind of group-based harm, not merely an individual violation. Calling rape sex without consent focuses all our attention on an individual act with a distinct perpetrator or small group of perpetrators and absolves the rest of us of any responsibility for the rape. Currently, in the US, gender-based crimes are considered to be distinct, singular events, and responsibility for them is attributed only to particular agents, right, or relatively small groups of identifiable agents. But there are advantages to viewing such crimes as part of a larger phenomenon for which we are all, to some extent, responsible. Just as in environmental law, we recognize cases in which a toxic environment and a particular person's or corporation's polluting action interact to cause harm to an individual or group, we should acknowledge that the harm of gender-based violence is a function of more than the acts of the individual perpetrators. Not only does a sexist environment play a role in influencing perpetrators to commit gender-based crimes, but it also makes such crimes more harmful to their victims than they otherwise would be. If we lived in a world without pervasive sexism, one in which women and men were genuinely held to be of equal worth, a victim would be able to perceive a gender-based crime against her as an anomaly, something truly random. But in the actual world, in which, because of pervasive sexism, victims of gender-based violence are often viewed as lacking credibility and perpetrators are rarely brought to justice, a sex crime can be, for a victim, a brutal confirmation of an already unjust status quo. Right. Viewing the wrongness of rape as consisting entirely in the lack of consent of the raped woman neglects also the ways in which other women are harmed by the prevalence and normalization of gender-based violence against women in our culture. Considering consent to have moral magic, making whatever is consented to morally permissible, neglects the ways in which what one person consents to can harm other people. Furthermore, consent is a low bar. Focusing exclusively on the harms of sex without consent can obscure the harms of consensual but unwanted or unwelcome sex, as Robin West has argued. It also ignores the many reasons girls and women consent to sex in order to avoid being raped. There have been a number of recent surveys of middle school and high school girls who say things like this. I mean, this could involve a prospective attitude of adjustment. I really don't want him to rape me. I mean, what would that say about him, about me, about us? So I better just agree to do what he wants. Or it could be a retrospective judgment about something that happened in the past. One way to avoid being raped is to call whatever happened to you something else. In a criminal court case, lack of consent is an essential part of the actus reus of rape, but consent alone is a low bar for determining whether sexual contact was morally permissible. And it's a really low bar for determining whether the sexual contact was good. I'm still a little baffled by the events on campuses that undergraduates organize, consent days and where consent is sexy t-shirts. I mean, I sort of get the point of that, but no one ever said, we had such amazing sex last night, I consented. A further reason why we shouldn't call rape simply sex without consent is that doing so reinforces pernicious stereotypes about men and women. It neglects to make explicit, while simultaneously relying on the role that gender inequality plays in rape. The language of consent assumes a double standard in heterosexual relations. It's assumed that the man, the strong, active, sexually aggressive partner, takes the initiative, seeking consent from the woman, the weak, passive, sexually submissive one. This isn't a new observation. As Carol Pateman wrote in 1980, an egalitarian sexual relationship cannot rest on this basis. It cannot be grounded in consent. I think we can make the most progress in reducing rape by viewing it, as Catherine McKinnon has argued, as a crime of gender inequality. Now note that this does not mean that under patriarchy all heterosexual sex is rape. Contrary to popular belief, McKinnon never said that. In a 2016 article, she reiterates her view that, quote, despite gender being an inequality, not all sex acts under conditions of this inequality are unequal on the basis of gender. Just as, and this is an interesting parallel, despite race being an inequality, friendship, an intrinsically equal concept, is possible with conscious work, however complex or fraught across racial lines. My point, she continues, is when a sexual interaction is equal, consent is not needed and does not occur because there is no transgression to be redeemed. Call it sex. If sex is equal between partners who socially are not, it is mutuality, reciprocity, respect, trust, desire, as well as sometimes fly-to-the-moon hope and a shared determination to slip the bonds of convention and swim upstream together, not one-sided acquiescence or ritualized obeisance that makes it intimate, interactive, moving, communicative, warm, personal, loving. End of quote. I've been talking about the power of words by showing how calling rape sex minus consent mystifies and obscures our social understanding of rape. But the power of words goes even deeper. It goes deep into our very selves. On my account, which I don't have time to defend here, a self is an embodied, socially constructed narrative. Persons do not arise ex nihilo and cannot be generated from human beings, that is, biological entities, in isolation. Given that personhood is a moral, social, legal concept, this may be obvious. I hold the less obvious view that other persons also constitute me as who I am. That is, they participate in my ongoing process of self-constitution. By self-constitution, I mean not constitution of a self all by itself, but rather the process by which a self is constituted, however that happens. On my view, other selves are essential to this process. More specifically, what others do with words plays a crucial role in my self-constitution. For example, how others use the term woman and employ the concept woman affects my self-constitution as a woman. If the concept of a woman is, among other things, the concept of someone who is rapeable with impunity, this is an inescapable part of my self-definition, whether I like it or not. I would go so far as to say that even those aspects of others' definition of woman, of which I'm not aware, can affect who I am. For to the extent that we say or conceive anything about ourselves, we're using language to categorize ourselves as members of groups and as bearers of properties. Although calling the self a narrative or noting that it's constituted by some sort of narrative structure might seem to suggest that individuals construct themselves by themselves in the solitary seclusion of a Cartesian dreamer, this is far from the case. If the self is a narrative, it's made up of social constructs and relations, out of words whose meanings, on my view, aren't in the head. On this account, how others talk about or depict or otherwise represent the groups with which we self-identify can affect not only how others treat us and how we treat ourselves, but also at the most fundamental level, who we actually are. Furthermore, how we use words and other representations can affect who we are, whether we're aware of it or not. Now, this claim strikes me as a wildly counterintuitive consequence of combining two views I hold and consider to be eminently reasonable. The first is that the self is a self-constituted and socially constructed embodied narrative. And the second is that social meanings aren't in the head, but are rather a function of how words are used within linguistic communities. I defended the first view in Aftermath and the second in my PhD dissertation. The way we're constructed is both constrained and facilitated by how others use the words and narratives we use to constitute ourselves. For example, it wasn't possible to constitute oneself as a homosexual before the term homosexuality and the category it denoted came into existence. I'm not saying here that the new use of the term introduced no more than new nomenclature, and for the record, I realize the word homosexual no longer functions as an acceptable label for gay men and lesbians, but the introduction of the term homosexual was the birth of a new narrative, which in turn gave birth to multiple evolving narratives. Even the introduction of new labels and their accompanied narratives that don't apply to us can change our identities. The existence of individuals who identify as transgender men and women changes the identity of cisgender men and women by giving rise to a new cisgender identity. There are, however, significant constraints on narrative self-construction and self-reconstruction. The main obstacle to self-reconstruction after trauma that I focused on in Aftermath was the difficulty of reestablishing bonds of trust with others. But now it's clearer to me that even when one is able to reestablish trust with the help of empathic listeners, there are obstacles to overcome, including the fact that there is only a limited stock of tropes and metaphors and other narratives available with which to make sense of one's experience, and the fact that the meanings of the words one uses in composing a narrative are socially constructed. Arguably, it's the representational constraint imposed by the culturally available means of expression that constitutes the most difficult obstacle for a trauma survivor to overcome. To the extent that we're stories we tell ourselves, we're not entirely in control of our self-definition, right? Because the meanings of the words with which we construct our self-narratives are not in our heads. And it should be noted that those with the most power tend to have the greatest ability to determine the meanings of our words. In Jacobellis versus Ohio, 1964 U.S. Supreme Court decision overturning the obscenity conviction of a movie theater manager, Justice Potter Stewart famously said of proscribable obscenity, "I know it when I see it." 2 decades later, Catherine MacKinnon responded to Justice Stewart, not quite as famously, quote, "But does he know what I know when he sees what I see?" And she noted that, quote, "When Justice Stewart said of obscenity, 'I know it when I see it,' that is even more interesting than it is usually taken to be, if viewed as a statement connecting epistemology, what he knows through his way of knowing, in this case seeing, with the fact that his seeing determines what obscenity is in terms of what he sees it to be because of his position of power." Or as Philip Gurevich said in his 1998 book about the Rwandan genocide, "Power consists in the ability to make others inhabit your story of their reality." So, what do we do now in light of all of this? Some have criticized MacKinnon for failing to adequately acknowledge women's agency in changing the world in which we've been constructed as relatively powerless. But social change is possible, on MacKinnon's view as well as on my own. And it is indeed imperative. For as MacKinnon writes, quote, "The world is not entirely the way the powerful say it is or want to believe it is. If it appears to be, it is because power constructs the appearance of reality by silencing the voices of the powerless, by excluding them from access to authoritative discourse. Powerlessness means when you say, 'This is how it is,' it is not taken as being that way. This makes articulating silence, perceiving the presence of absence, believing those who have been socially stripped of credibility, critically contextualizing what passes for simple fact, necessary to the epistemology of a politics of the powerless," end quote. I still want to claim that there is freedom in narrative self-constitution, even if the self and the categories that make it up are social constructs, especially if we've been victimized, traumatized, or stigmatized by the speech and other acts of expression of others. It's essential for flourishing and maybe even for surviving to construct new, or at least tolerable, but ideally liberatory counter-narratives to the oppressive, soul-destroying ones that have been thrust upon us and to some extent internalized. The new narratives must have sufficient cognitive and affective authority to ring truer and louder than the old traumatizing ones. The words out of which our narratives are made have to be rehabilitated or perhaps replaced. We must find new words or burn, and we must listen to those who may be harmed by our words. If we throw words at people like knives, we don't get to say whether or not they hurt. And so, like one who seeks to warn the city of an impending flood, but speaks another language, so do we come forward and report that evil has been done us. Listen to the survivors. Learn our language. What we are saying is intelligible. What should be utterly incomprehensible is sexual violence. It's up to us to make it stop making sense. Thank you. We have time for a short Q&A, and there are microphones at either aisle. And if you raise your hands.
So it sounds like it might be, besides philosophers, it sounds like you're suggesting that artists and culture are the ground from which this will be built up. Do you see any promising leads? You mentioned some poets. What other promising leads do you see?
Yeah. I do think that what's essential is changing the culture, and that artists have a really large role in doing that. I used to focus more on legal reform, and there was significant rape law reform over the last few decades. It used to be the case that one could not be convicted of raping one's wife because one's wife was not rapeable, right? That's changed, right, in all 50 states, but it's still really difficult, virtually impossible, to get a jury to convict a man for raping his wife, right, because of attitudes about that. So I think it's really important for the culture to change. I feel encouraged by recent developments, by the Me Too movement. Sexual harassment law has been on the books since 1986, right? But it was very difficult for women to come forward and accuse someone of sexual harassment and be believed, right, until this cultural shift happened and enough women came forward and began to be believed, right? So I think art is very important. That's why I sing and read poetry.
So one of the things that you were talking about is kind of the self versus other dichotomy and transgressing that through constitution of the self by others that are around us. Would I be correct in asking if you are using Beauvoir's theory of ambiguity there, and what discursive possibilities that opens up for transcending that? And on top of that, if you would say that survivors and those who are victims of sexual violence, that they're stuck in a kind of state of imminence because of that, a narrative paralysis, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you. Simone de Beauvoir was actually the first philosopher I read in high school, and I read everything that she wrote, and even had the wonderful opportunity to interview her when I was probably your age. Given all of that, though, I'm not sure I can answer this question adequately here in this venue, so we should probably talk more about it later. But what I can say for now is that I think some of the backlash to victim narratives, it occurred in the early 90s, it's occurring again now in response to Me Too, comes from self-identified feminists who say, women are turning themselves into victims, or feminists are turning women into victims. People are being defined solely by their victimization. And another way of putting that would be they're accusing victims, or those who are focusing on victimization, of wallowing in imminence, of defining themselves as things that are victims with no possibility of transcending that victimhood. I think it's just a mistake. I mean, no one is entirely a victim, and acknowledging one's victimization is far from turning oneself into a thing that is a victim. I think it's necessary in order to go on and be a survivor.
Hello, I would like to ask if you or anyone else is doing work to create that new terminology you mentioned for a definition that is sexualized, gender-based violence, because, and that is my question.
Some people are trying to. It's a work in progress. I mean, I really am asking for help. I think this is something that we all need to do together.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. It was really fascinating. I have two questions that, both of which may seem a little bit out in left field, but it's late in the day. Everybody will tolerate it. So the first one is, you said often that the meanings are not in your head, which is an expression that I really like, and it makes me wonder about something that I've thought many times in the past, which is meaning locatable in space? Is there some place where we can locate meaning? Is it in the practices? Is it in the relations? and so on. And the second one, speaking of relations, near the beginning of your talk, you talked about speaking with the Attorney General in Grenoble, and I was just wondering what language that conversation was had in, because I've been teaching French for 30 years almost, and I know I would have a difficult time navigating that vocabulary in French, especially under extreme trauma. And also, our students who go to France, there's a certain kind of epistemic violence that's involved in making that leap into another language, and often they suffer that violence because they don't exactly understand. Like the French are notorious for making certain kinds of jokes that are somewhat vicious and even sadistic. And so I had a student in my office a couple of weeks ago who was basically in tears because she had suffered that kind of violence. Thank you.
Oh, there's a lot there. I do think that meanings of words are a function of how the words are used in a linguistic community. I'm very influenced by Wittgenstein in that respect. It was challenging for me to, first of all, survive the assault in French. Right? I needed to plead with my assailant in French, and then to go through the criminal justice proceedings. It actually became virtually impossible for me to speak French after that. I mean, I still have a lot of trouble. And before that, I was fluent enough to interview Simone de Beauvoir in French. Now I'm forgetting the last thing that you asked that I wanted to respond to. Yeah, the differences. The lawyer that we retained while I was in the hospital to just navigate the criminal justice system, I think he wasn't aware that I was listening to him, but at one point he was meeting with another lawyer and talking about what kind of crime victims' compensation I would be entitled to. My assailant was indigent, but I had unreimbursed medical expenses and was entitled to some kind of compensation. So they were having this little discussion over there about what that would be. And I overheard my lawyer talking about two different kinds of rape. One was un viol gentil, a nice rape, and un viol méchant, a nasty rape or naughty rape. And they did agree that what happened to me was probably méchant. Right? That just blew my mind. So I don't know if we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. And I hope this question isn't too simplistic, but I was struck by the way you characterized the problem in the first third of the talk as an inability to see or the lack of a language, or there's a sort of, you mentioned a few philosophers who seem to have been confused about the topic, and I wonder if framing it in that way makes the problem seem too easy, because it seems to me there's extreme incentives involved in maintaining the confusion of this language, and so merely finding the language doesn't solve the further problem of overcoming the desire for further confusion. Thank you.
Right, thank you. That's an excellent question to end with. I mean, because I'm a philosopher, language is my tool. I trade in language. But obviously that's not enough. And I'm very honored to have invited someone to the talk today, Winona Ward, who's sitting next to Tom, who has done an incredible job of changing the way victims of domestic violence can get legal assistance in the state of Vermont. She started an organization called Have Justice Will Travel, and she goes around the state of Vermont providing not only legal advice, but social services, financial assistance. This is what we really need. We need people doing that kind of work. Words alone are not enough. So, thank you.
It was amazing.
Thanks.